Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be hearing tales of skinwalkers and wendigos. So I hope you're ready, because it's time to get comfortable. Grab your Native American charms, and let the darkness take control. I had an experience many years back that I finally want to put down on paper. It was in 2003 when I was moving from California to New York. I haven't mentioned this story to anyone except those closest to me, because my fear is that talking about it will bring it back to me. It's bad enough to keep haunting memories in hidden caverns of my mind. I also don't want people to think that I've lost my mind out in the Arizona desert on that starry night. I live in Denmark now, so that night in the American desert seems like a world and era away. Nothing happened to me, in the sense of the body. While it was happening, it was terrifying and traumatizing. I have never been so scared, so alone in such a huge empty world, and in such imminent danger as that night. If you fear that talking about or reading about animal spirits can conjure them into your life, I recommend you stop listening here. Here is the story. I had taken a job offer in New York City and quit my job in San Francisco. So I had a month in between of free time. This was just a couple of years after university. So I have friends that had moved back from our university town in Santa Cruz to various places around the country. With this free month, I could do what I wished. So I packed my things, everything I owned, into my pickup truck with a camper top, and headed out on a road trip to visit my college friends around the country while driving to New York. Honestly, I lost track of time in Los Angeles after many nights at various venues and events. I had been crashing at the apartment of my friend Kyle, actually crashing at the apartment of some girl that Kyle was crashing at, as there was always another big event being promoted, or just another reason to stay a few more days. I woke up on Tuesday morning, wrote a goodbye note, and ventured out to find my pickup truck with all my stuff. It was a bit of a panic, because had it been stolen, the only physical possession I would still have in this world would be the knapsack on my shoulder. Fortunately, I found the truck, pulled out heading for Las Vegas. The next city I wanted to visit a friend was in Atlanta. But I figured I'd do some solo adventuring and hit Las Vegas and the Grand Canyon while in this part of the country. When I came to the desert town of Barstow, which is a couple of hours east of Los Angeles, I lost control of the truck for a few seconds, grabbed the steering wheel, and managed to pull over haphazardly, but safely, to the shoulder of the highway. This was lucky, as the highway had a lot of big trucks. I got out to inspect, and my back left tire was flat. These details are not part of the experience in Arizona, but set the scene leading up to it. It was a feeling of the days of several days of socializing with wannabe celebrities in Los Angeles, followed by what felt like a very unsafe and shocking experience on the desert highway. I switched out the flat tire for the spare. Each time a big rig would be heading my way, I would literally run around my parked pickup truck to avoid it and stay safe. The flat tire being on the left side of my truck meant I had to jack the truck up and do their work with my body situated just by the most right lane of the highway. This is the lane that the big trucks like to drive in. All was fine. I could drive a few miles until I found a tire repair shop. It was a small, cheap shop somewhere in the desert, run by Spanish-speaking Mexicans. The shop was one of those cinder block and aluminium workshops, with plenty of tires hanging along the walls with cheap prices painted on them on wet paint. It turns out it was just the air intake valve that broke, likely from the desert heat. It literally only cost $4.50 to repair. That being all good, I realized that it was now close to sunset, so I changed my plans and decided to forget Las Vegas and the Grand Canyon solo adventure and hightail it out for my next destination city, all the way on the East Coast, Atlanta, Georgia. This would turn out to be the most terrifying night of my life. The flat tire was just the fear appetizer before the pure dread of hell that would be unleashed. So I pull out of the tire repair shop, determined to get to the East Coast as soon as I could, and not stop unless necessary. I decided that I was going to drive east as long as I could, until I was too tired and would then rest in the truck. Early in the evening, I was really enjoying the drive, with a crimson red and glittering gold sun behind me. The desert was beautiful in its vast, empty serenity. As I had spent most of the past 2 years in an office environment, I was feeling exultation by the chance to be under such a gigantic and beautiful open sky above the flat sand of the desert, and the tall cactuses were majestic and proud as they scrolled past my truck on each side. Sunset fell into darkness, and the celestial show above the desert was another display of the natural world's unbelievable beauty. There was no moon. At one chance, I pulled over just to look up. The road was pretty empty. It was not quite midnight, and aside from stars, I could see the Milky Way. And when you see it like that, it really lives up to its name. Suddenly I felt uncomfortable. I had a sense that this intoxicating beauty was somehow luring me into danger, and I was surprised to suddenly feel very alone. It was just little me and all my humble belongings packed under the camper top of an old yellow Toyota pickup truck. I drove on. My fascination with the natural beauty soon wandered until the night desert was like a hypnotist of sand and cactus counting down from 10 and putting me into a trance. The road was all mine at this hour, and it was one of those moments where it felt like I could be the only person alive on the planet. And then I saw something in my rearview mirror to remind me I wasn't alone. It wasn't a car though. It was a man. He was running, but as I was driving faster, I thought that I must have just driven past him and just see him now. I drove on, but I was no longer sleepy. I was wide awake and my mind was racing to rationalize what it had just seen. I didn't get a good view, but I had seen a man. It just didn't add up. Something was off. I couldn't think of a scenario where a man would be running along the freeway late at night, way out in the desert. I relaxed for some moments. I must just be seeing things. Some of those cactuses could make you think you saw anything. I drove on, with an elevated sense of alertness. Now I didn't want to stop. There might be something out there. And you know, I'm gonna see him again. I knew that night I would see him again. So I drove on that straight road leading east. I saw him again in my rearview mirror. This time he was not fading away, but holding speed about 10 or 12 car lengths behind. I could barely see him. I checked my speed. I was doing about 60 miles per hour. Impossible. I let my speed slag off a bit, and indeed the man got closer. I could see him real good now. He was about 2 to 3 car lengths behind me, and illuminated slightly red from my backlights. He was naked, barefoot, and running like that. It was amazing and terrifying. What is this creature, and what does it want with me? I decided I had had enough. Floored it. My truck was pretty loaded and doesn't accelerate that good anyway, so as the speedometer moved ever so slowly up, my focus remained on the man running slowly behind me. He picked up speed and ran around so that he was running in the oncoming lane to my left from the driver's side window. I could see him real good now through the driver's side window. His hair was dark and pushed back, about neck length, and his skin dark and his face black, with angled white stripes, like he had some kind of war paint on it. I checked the speedometer. I was nearly hitting 90. I drove on, and he ran with me. I did not understand how this man could run this fast and barefoot. He then accelerated faster than I was driving at, and I watched him run off ahead of me at an insane speed. I couldn't believe the speed of those legs moving as he sprinted down the straight, flat road. I drove on, with my heart pounding, adrenaline pumping, and sheer waves of dread pulsing through my body. I thought to turn around and go the opposite way, but I realized, what's the use? If he can run that fast, it doesn't matter. I hadn't seen a car or any humans, at least ones who can't outrun a car, for over an hour. And then the truck bumped. There were stones on the highway. There were small stones, but I tapped on the brake. And then I floored the brake because the man was standing in the middle of the street with his arms up and out, a bit like he was putting on a challenging display. He pointed both of his index fingers at me with parallel arms, and then, while holding his gaze, he wiped his neck with his finger horizontally from left to right, mimicking a throat cutting by a knife. I understood this sign language. The man walked up to the outside by the driver's side door and tapped on my window several times. I was afraid he would break the window. He was speaking in some language, like a Native American language that made no sense to me. I could see his face very clearly. He did have some kind of black paint on his face with 3 white stripes under each eye, as well as a white oval on his forehead. He continues his rant, blustering with a firm gaze. I was relieved to see 2 headlights in the rearview mirror. A rig was approaching. The man looked in the direction from where we had come. He looked back at me, and I saw his eyes. They were dark. At that instant, the man ran off away from the road and into the deep desert. The truck veered into the oncoming lane to pass, and my truck shook and wanned from the vacuum and force of air as the rig passed with its blaring horn, giving a deafening Doppler effect. And it passed. And in sudden silence, I watched the dust fall back to the road as the rig slowly vanished into the darkness ahead. I drove on. The sun rose, and only stopping to get gas in New Mexico, I did not dare take my sleep break until I was in Texas Wednesday night. I will not be doing any driving in the desert of the American Southwest. I feel as though there is a spirit there that knows who I am. We have unfinished business, and I prefer not to see it again. This happened about 4 years ago, when I was on my spring break. My uncle, who got his TV turned off, asked us if he could house sit for us while we were away. We accepted this offer and didn't mind him watching TV, just as long as he kept the house clean. Halfway through our stay, my parents get a call from my uncle. He told my parents that last night he was watching TV and happened to leave the porch window curtain open. That window is about 10 feet to the left of our TV at the time. My uncle said that he turned to look at the window and he saw a man standing there. Our porch is pretty old and wooden. You could easily hear when someone is walking up the steps. Our dog, an outdoor dog, didn't even make a sound either. My uncle was spooked until he recognized the man standing out there. I don't know who he was, but most of my family did know him. But before my uncle could do anything, the man walked away. When my family came back home a few days later, my mum told me this story. But what really spooked me out was the man died 3 days after my uncle saw him on our porch. Now, I'm a Navajo. In my culture, we have these evil people called Skinwalkers. They say when you catch a Skinwalker during the act and expose their identity, they'll die in 3 days. I'm still unsure whether this man was one of these Skinwalkers, why he was at our house, and him passing so suddenly is still a mystery to this day. I was driving around my friend's old neighborhood, keeping an eye on the place, as it was quite the hotspot for unnatural occurrences. One such instance is when he and I were walking down his street. The sun was setting, and the evening breeze glided through the trees, all the while this peaceful, heavy, and suffocating surreality filled the atmosphere. Just as a shiver went up my back, he turned to the edge of the woods, and I followed suit soon after. As if on cue, a man's yell, painful and full of agony, broke the eerie serenity of the evening. Now on edge, hasten our paces and walk hurriedly. His home was just 10 minutes from where we were, but we were aware that anything could happen between here and there if we were not careful. About 5 minutes away from his home, another yell boomed from the woods, only this time it altered from before, becoming more and more animalistic as it dragged on. We increased our pace again, the daylight almost completely gone, and after what felt like an hour we finally reached his front porch. That's when we heard it. Behind us in the woodline we heard a screech, an awful combination of a rooster's crow and a dog's bark. After that, whatever it was, hissed and began coming towards us quickly. The leaves in the trees rustled as it got nearer and nearer, jumping down from the branches and into the brush of the bushes and smaller foliage. We heard it land on the ground, and soon after, it came crashing towards us, stopping just before it broke out of the wood's cover. Whatever it was, it began breathing heavily and pointed its bony clawed finger out of the brush at us, curling it as if a motion to tempt us to approach it. Not long after, my friend unlocked his door, swung it open, and we both stumbled its side, slamming it shut behind us. Right as we did, whatever that thing was slammed up against the door, as if trying to break it down, if not at the very least, to frighten us. It then sounded as if it jumped from his porch and back into a tree, dashing back into the woods. Later on that night, we heard some occasional scratching, as well as tapping on the windows and other parts of the house, but we didn't bother to open the blinds or investigate for obvious reasons. Thankfully, we had the pleasure to not see what the rest of it looked like, but did have the misfortune of hearing it scream. That's just one of the many uncomfortable, yet equally exciting experiences we've had together. If you want to investigate the area, be sure to visit Holbrook, South Carolina. It's in Dorchester County, a quaint and quiet little neighborhood. Unfortunately, most of it has been deforested for housing development, but that doesn't exactly restrain any odd thing from occurring. Just be on guard and stay safe. I live in a suburban neighborhood with lots of large trees. Even before too late in the day, it gets pretty dark and moody. My mum once sent me to run an errand, to stop by a friend's house down the street and collect something. The route takes me through a stretch of road that has some parked cars on either side of the street. It was 6, early evening. At about 15 minutes into my walk, I saw a little kid riding a bike in my direction from the opposite end of the road. I also happened to see that sitting by one of the parked cars ahead of me was a skinny black dog. It was large and slender looking, like a greyhound, but also shaggy. The dog just seemed to be sitting there looking in the kid's direction. It didn't seem to have noticed me, so I just walked forward to fulfill my errand. It wasn't until I was some 10 to 15 feet away that I realized something was not right with this animal. It remained seated on his haunches, but it was now very clear to me that its back legs were much too long for its body and folded in an unnatural way. But more disturbing than that was what it was doing with its front paws. This is something I will never forget seeing. The dog's forelegs were positioned in front, where they should have been, but I stopped in my tracks when I realized that the paws were patting the ground in unison, kind of like the way you feel for lost keys in a blanket. The dog seemed to be drumming on the ground in anticipation or excitement, or it was pretending to be a dog with paws on the ground, and it was looking at this clueless child heading down its way. I must have made some sort of sound, even as I was frozen in place, because the patting ceased, and this thing slowly got up on its back legs and stood up like a man. It was easily 6 feet tall, maybe more. I turned around and began to sprint home. I had my back to it, but I knew it was looking at me, so I just got out of there. To this day, I don't know what happened to the little kid. This happened when I was around 11 or 12. It was a warm summer's night. I was staying the weekend with a couple of friends. The first few nights were quite uneventful, but seeing as this was my first time staying at a farmhouse, I was glad it was that way. The wind and the way the trees moved scared me though, more than it did the others. The first night, we'd opted to stay indoors for the most part, playing Call of Duty as normal prepubescent teenagers do. Later, we elected to explore outside as a group, rummaging through an old fort my friend had built with tires and wooden pallets. As it approached 8 p.m., the sun began its descent, and my friend's mother ushered us all inside as she was preparing supper. Later that night, we hung out in the basement, again playing Call of Duty. I arose around 7 to the sound of a cat hissing outside the southernmost window in the basement, along with a yap, never to be heard from again. I went to bed thinking that it was probably 2 cats playing, as he had dozens on the farm, and they tended to do that. The next day was completely uneventful, until 5 in the afternoon. We ascended into this shifty and quite terrifying treehouse that looked like it was designed by an 11-year-old. As we ascended the ladder, my friend opened the door and a cat scurried out faster than I could acknowledge. As we entered the treehouse, we saw it. A cat, completely ripped apart with blood all over the floor. It's a sight I will never get out of my head. We thought that it was far too much for us and informed my friend's parents, and instead went back inside to cool off. Everyone resumed Call of Duty, which I had grown bored of at the time, so elected to play with Nerf guns, as I thought real-life army was much more fun to play. I was off around in the house with the mission of being a sniper, peering out of windows and taking shots at my targets of the imagination. As the sun was setting, I peered out of the third-story bedroom window into the edge of the growing cornfield and saw a black cat. It was standing on its hind legs, just staring. I know cats were prone to doing this, but not for extended periods. This cat was there for no more than 30 seconds, just standing there staring. It made me feel uneasy, almost as if the cat was calling to me, asking for help. It looked hurt, with what appeared like blood covering its fur, although it was hard to tell, seeing as I was over 100 meters away. I brushed it off as my mind wandering, as I had a creative imagination at the time. As I went downstairs, my friends were running outside, announcing that they were playing tag, which I happily agreed to. We were obsessed with the idea of hide-and-seek tag, which we would call infection. When a person wasn't found and tagged, they would help the seekers until the last was found. We paired up and ran as the seekers started counting. Sadly, there were only 3 of us hiding, so if we wanted pairs, one of us would be left alone. I opted for my 2 friends to run off into the tree line, while I approached from the east side of the land, where the corn was growing. I followed the rows of corn around 12 to 15 stalks in, not deep enough to stop all light from entering. As I stopped to take a breath, a deep feeling of dread washed over me. I heard a voice. It was deep, growling, approaching me from behind. Thinking it was one of my friends playing a prank, I spun around to see a tall figure in the dark of my own shadow. With low visibility, I couldn't make out many details, but it looked almost identical to an antelope, but larger. This was very odd, as antelopes aren't common in eastern Iowa. It began asking me to help it, and that it was hurt. I stood there in shock. My fight or flight response wasn't developed enough, as it inched closer, and I heard my friends running and laughing. It felt like an eternity. The figure began around 40 feet away from me, barely visible, to now be around 20, maybe even 15 feet away. I could see it now. It was a deer-like figure, mangled and torn, with ribs exposed and intestines poking through its abdomen. When I finally realized what it was, I turned and ran. Now, I wasn't that fast of a runner, although I was a distance runner, but I cleared this cornfield quicker than if I even imagined. I ran until I hit a tree line that my other friends could be seen at, running with flashlights trying to find our second-to-last friend. I told my friends what I saw, and of course they did not believe me. I was absolutely terrified. After they realized how spooked I was, we all went inside to continue our video games. My friend at the time, Jacob, whose parents owned the house and land, had told me how this was once Indian territory, and how there had been great bloodshed and fighting. He brought out an old book and showed me artifacts that archaeologists had found near his land, arrowheads and other neat tools that Indians used in this area. When he got to the mythological part of the book, he brought up a thing called the Skinwalker. After reading about it, I told them about what happened in the cornfields and announcing that I had found one of these fabled creatures. I was blown off and laughed at, but I had known exactly what I'd seen. I slept only 2 hours that night, scared of the dark and what was in it. And it's depressing to say that I only went to these friends' house one other time due to these events. Now that I've graduated, I looked back at these stories and realized how lucky I truly had it. If I'd either helped the cat or deer out when they had called to me, what would have happened? What would have happened if this Skinwalker had approached me any faster in the cornfields? Would I still be here? Or would I be one of these things? This happened in July of this year, in the northeastern part of Arizona, south of the Native American reservation. I've never had any experience with skinwalkers before, but honestly, after reading about them, I'm thoroughly convinced I saw one. There was one time I went camping with 2 of my buddies, but neither of them are the real outdoorsy type. I was just kind of getting them into the whole camping/hunting scene. Now, I love hiking, exploring more like, because I hate just walking a trail. You see nothing new, so I took 2 friends out there and got 2 miles from camp when they just wanted to return. I said fine and showed them where to go on my phone and made them put a waypoint on the other little GPS thing I had to follow. I wanted to keep going, so I did so, by myself. They wanted the pistol I had on me for safety reasons, leaving me to walk alone in the forest with water and nothing else. No big deal, I thought. I found a steep hillside with rocks all the way down when I was about 5 miles from camp and decided to go down. I followed the path at the bottom of this thing, which was at this point just a dry riverbed. I walked down and it got steeper as I went further south. When I crossed a certain point, something just felt wrong. I started trying to look around for anything, but there was a huge log across the 2 hillsides, and when I crouched down to crawl under it, it felt like I was being watched. I looked up to my left and saw nothing, looked around to see if there was anything in the middle of the riverbed, then looked up to the right. There was a huge black canine. Too small to be a bear, but it looked like a wolf on steroids. That dog creature and I held glances for what felt like hours, but I knew it couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. Every passing moment made the feeling of dread worsen. I moved backwards to get the hell out of there, and when I moved, the wolf thing just booked it into the forest further from camp. In hindsight, this thing was moving faster than any dog I've ever seen. The walk back was eerie. It didn't feel as much as I was being watched, as to just the feeling of, it will catch me eventually. And that's why I don't hike alone anymore. This story is from my girlfriend, who is full Navajo. She grew up on the reservation in New Mexico. She had this uncle, who was more like an older cousin from my understanding. This guy was in his 50s, and had been married to the same woman his entire life. One night, he woke up in a terrible sweat and felt super uneasy about the woman lying next to him in the bed. No sooner had he thought it than the door creaked open, and he watched some broken and black creature slink across the bedroom floor and crawl back into his wife's body. He told some friends and family, but word got back to his wife about what he witnessed. 2 days later, he died of a heart attack in bed. Since last summer, me and my boyfriend have seen some really weird stuff. He lives in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by cornfields and long roads. We usually hang around his house, and it's just getting weirder since last summer. That was when we tried walking to another friend's house, and we went on the wrong road. He immediately noticed it was weird. At one point, we see a cat crying, trying to get us to come over to it. As we approach, it darts into a field. We try to approach it again, and it will not leave the field. It's desperately trying to lure us in. But we didn't, and darted off. Later that night, we go walking in the countryside again. It carried the same "something isn't right" kind of energy as last time, and we stopped at a crossroads to get picked up by a friend. Then we saw something else. This time it was a coyote in the middle of the road. Now there wasn't much light, but I swear I saw that thing stand up as it went to leave. After that night, we had more paranormal experiences. Some that I can't tell if it was skinwalkers or something else. But last night was one of the things I truly believe was. We have a habit of sitting in his car at night, not driving or even leaving the driveway. We just sit and listen to music. Last night this was the case. We were talking, and out of nowhere a dog starts walking from out behind the house. The dog looked weird. Its body was too large, its eyes didn't reflect light, and its legs were lanky and just didn't look right. It didn't bend its legs at all while walking. Another weird detail is there was no way to tell if this dog was male or female. It had no junk. It saw us and immediately tried to act more like a dog, rolling around on the ground and sniffing at things. It kept walking around the car, getting closer, and we were both pretty freaked out. But I was trying to get him calmed down and show it was okay. Then this dog makes eye contact with us, and in the most stiff-legged leap throws itself onto the porch and walks to the entrance, then watches us to see what we do. After neither of us move, it throws itself back off the porch and goes behind the shed. We didn't leave the car for hours, and during our first attempt, we opened the doors, hearing the dog bark from all different fields around the house. The dog barks sounded like a loop of the same bark in intervals over and over. Eventually, we just sprinted out of the car and into the house before 3 a.m. could hit. So, with all that stated, what could this be? This story takes place in New Mexico, very close to the Navajo reservation. A woman and 2 of her friends were driving at night on a dark road. The location was surrounded by dense forest bushes, not exactly trees, but still large enough to obscure surroundings along the road. Her friends were passed out, probably from drinking, leaving her to drive the open road alone. She kept driving and eventually met a lot of elk on the road and on the sides in the brush. Apparently there were a lot of elk gathered in this one spot along the road, and that's when she noticed something off about them. They had the upper body of an elk, but the lower body of a man. That's when these elk humanoids blocked the road and began attacking the car. She was about a 3-hour drive from where she was going, another native reservation, but at that moment, she decided to get the hell out of there, made a U-turn, and went back the way she came. That's when she called the local police, and they escorted her and her friends back home without incident. A lot of activity like this is very common in the area, and without getting into too much detail, it's usually to do with skinwalkers and the supernatural. I'm fully convinced I saw a skinwalker once. I was walking from my ex's house to my friend's house, which is roughly a 2-mile walk, when I saw this strange dog-looking thing in her neighbor's yard when I first started the walk. Her neighbor didn't have a dog, and I had a flashlight for the walk. When I shone it over, it didn't reflect any of the light. It still looked like a shadow, despite the fact it was in the middle of my beam. That freaked me out. Not to mention the fact that I felt something following me the whole way to my friend's house, but I just kept moving and didn't look back. This was in an extremely rural town, with no street lights and just roads and trees. I made it to my friend's house with no issue, but when I got there, my friend's dog was freaking the hell out, making noises the likes of which I'd never heard it make, and quite literally throwing itself against the door in an attempt to get out. It was freaky. That dog is a little rambunctious, but he's never acted like that before or since. And then in the following few months, I kept seeing this cat in my backyard when I went out of the porch for a cigarette. The cat looked odd. There was just something about it. And every time I saw it, it scared me, and I went back in. The real icing on the cake, though, is that I was just followed home by a coyote. Now, I'm sure the real story is that I just got followed by a coyote that night, which is possible, as it was in the middle of the woods, and that it was just the neighbor's cat in my backyard who has since passed, as he was pretty old looking. But after reading all of these skinwalker stories, which I have been since before this encounter, I can't help but think, maybe it just lost interest in me once I realized I wasn't gonna let it get me. And why did that cat put an immense feeling of dread within me? This happened to me, and I'm not quite sure what to do. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's tales of skinwalkers. Certainly very creepy indeed. I'd like to give a huge thank you to everyone you see on screen. Specifically, Christy, who used her power token to put out a poll for you guys, and the poll, of course, was with skinwalkers as the winner. However, I really did like the other two options, and I'm actively looking for ghost towns as we speak. Abandoned cemeteries is also in the works, but these are very specific topics and quite challenging to find. But we should hopefully see some of these soon. Also, a huge thank you and shout out to JenJ71, Christian Lopez, and Insane Terrier, who have also recently joined Patreon, and this really helps me out. I'm really grateful for all of you guys, so thank you. If there's a story you wish to share, you can email it to me or post it to my Reddit. If you enjoyed tonight's video, don't forget to let me know down below by pressing the subscribe button, the like button, and the bell icon, just for good measure. Alright then guys, for now though, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.